Vayavo Avraham lispod l'sara v'liv kosa. Avram teaches us, the Torah teaches us, there's time for Bechi and there's time for Hesped. And though Hesped took place also 30 days ago, my father's Levaya, a Shloshim gives us a little distance to evaluate, to put into perspective, to call some eternal lessons to take with us. Now, Kibbut Avayim is one of the most basic mitzvos. There are more chairs. People, nobody has to stand. Just take some chairs back. Kibbut Avayim is one of the most basic mitzvos, one of the Yesodos of Yadus. It is the transitionary dibur. We've spoken about this on the Luchos, right? So Kibbut Avayim is down at number 5. It's the transitionary dibur, which has both elements. This mitzvah applies both mechayim of the parent and la'achar misa. Different themes, different halachos. So I stand here today on my father's Shloshim at a transitionary point between these poles, faintly holding on, maybe not so faintly, trying to hold on to the Kibbut Avayim Mechayim, but preparing myself for what's ahead, Kibbut Avayim La'achar Misa. I just take comfort in the fact that my parents couldn't be separate from each other. So I had 11 months between my cottages, between finishing for my mother and starting with my father, but they're together. My father taught me a medrash that he mentioned at my uncle's Levaya. We'll get back to him a little bit later. Hashem. Pasuk says in Koheles, Tov Yom Hamaves Miyom Hivaldo. Greater is the day of death than the day of birth. And that's why in Judaism we celebrate yard sites. We don't celebrate birthdays. Washington's birthday, Lincoln's birthday. We celebrate yard sites. Why? Because the Medrash gives a mashal. When you have a boat that's going out on a journey and it has a lot of wares and a lot of destinations that it was going to go to. So when the boat goes out, there's some people there, a few people there just wishing it well. But when the boat comes back after a successful journey, after all the destinations that it went to, so then there's a big crowd. It's a big crowd that says, excellent, successful mission, a job well done. Tov Yom Hamaves Miyom Hivaldo. Greater is the date of death. And I mentioned in today's Parsha Shir, I just gave it this morning, the Pasuk says, the beginning of this week's Parsha, Maseh, Vayichtov Moshe es motzoehem l'maseihem, ve'ela maseihem l'motzoehem. So Rav Zevin writes in LaTorah v'Lamoadim, what's the lashon of motzoehem l'maseihem, from where you came from to where you're going to, and then from where you're going to where you're coming back. So Rav Zevin says, each of us are writing a book. And every page in the book is a day of our life. And we all set out on a journey. HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends us out when we're born. Ve'ele motzoehem l'maseihem. And we go out on that journey to sanctify God's name for 120 years. But ultimately, ve'ele motzoehem l'maseihem. We come back to where we came from. We come back to be with HaKadosh Baruch Hu once again after the time that we have in this world. We celebrate tonight a mission accomplished. 60 plus books, svarim, hundreds of articles, putting Jewish medical ethics on the map, being a walking Kiddush Hashem for the entire world. Thousands of lectures and shiurim, numerous cycles of daf yomi, as long as I can remember, Shnayim Mikra every Friday night, using a bencher whenever he benched, and Kriya Shema Lamita, would never say it by heart, and would say it. And would always use a bencher. I remember the one he had right by his desk. I grew up, Rosner? Oh, Dr. Rosner? I said, yeah, the Dr. Rosner? It was always a couple of steps. I grew up in my father's shadow. And I wore that, and I wear that badge with pride. But all this takes added significance. Everything that my father accomplished takes added significance based on the Tov Yom Hamaves Miyom Hivaldo. When we think back to his Yom Hivaldo, to where he came from. My remarks tonight will give an overview of my father's life, peppered with some stories, and towards the end of the talk, we'll learn 4 or 5 concrete messages that we could take from his life. My father was born in 1935 in Berlin. My grandparents were from Poland, so we're not yucky. We wait 6 hours, though my father was very yucky in his demeanor. But we are not Yeki. My father, at age 3, 1938, he was put on the kinder transport. And with his brother and his sister, my father was 3. My aunt, I forgot exactly how old. My uncle was 10. He was 7 years older than my father. And they ended up in an orphanage in northern England for most of the war. And that's where they spent the war. My grandparents survived, unlike almost the entire family. The entire family was wiped out in Auschwitz. They were each one of 7 and 10, like 17 siblings. That's just like one generation up. But the only ones that survived were my grandparents, who never, I heard recently that my grandmother spoke to about it with somebody, but my grandparents, that I remember them, they never spoke about it. They never spoke about the war. They never spoke about how they survived. We know little tidbits about being hidden in families and jumping out of the top of the barn, but we don't know. But they ended up in Belgium after the war. But part of the miracle of my father's survival has to do with one brother. My grandparents and one brother of my grandfather survived. They ended up in Belgium after the war, in Brussels. And nobody knew who was alive. Nobody knew. My grandparents made it to Brussels. They came in contact with my aunt, who went to Holland. But my father and my uncle were in an orphanage. There were 2 frum English soldiers that ate over at my grandparents' house for Shabbos. And they recognized the name Rosner. They said, Rosner, there's a man, an older man in not so old, but a man in London that davens with us in shul. His name is Rosner, and he goes to visit two of his nephews somewhere up north at an orphanage every couple of weeks. And they did the research, and they realized that these were their children, that they survived. So this was 1945. They sent word, the Red Cross. So my uncle was 17. He came back right away. My father, Kedarka Bakodesh, he wanted to finish the school year. So at 10 years old, I don't know where that came from, but so he stayed for the next couple of months until June 1945. And then he remembers he was 10 years old. He was put on a boat. He took a train to southern England, and he went on a boat. And he remembers the boat. He was on the boat, and they come towards Ostend, exact port city in Belgium. And he remembers being on the boat, holding the hands of the captain is holding his hand. And he remembers seeing hundreds of people on the shore, like a whole group of people. And he says he remembers. He sees as it's pulling in, he sees this man with a hat and a coat go underneath the rope and run up the plank and start talking to the woman and the captain, the papers, enjoying the papers. And my grandfather is brought over to be introduced to my father. My father was 3 the last time he saw his father, and now he's 10. And they give each other a hug. My father starts talking to him, and they realize they cannot communicate with each other, because my father only knows English. He's been in the orphanage his whole life, and my grandfather knows Yiddish and German and Polish, no English. So after 7 years of not seeing each other, they're connected, but they can't communicate. So 2-hour train ride to Brussels, and my grandmother knew English. My father pretty soon learned Yiddish. My father knew 7 languages. He said, after you learn 4 or 5, the others they come. I'm like, I don't understand that. Hebrew, English, Yiddish, German, Flemish, all of the ones. But so my uncle, my great uncle at that time, had a say in getting them back. About 20 years ago, again, a couple of other, trying to go in chronological order, there's a story that we didn't find out until about 20 years ago. And we didn't know the story for 50 years. 20 years ago, 22, I don't know exactly how many, my father receives an email. My father never used a computer. His 60-plus Sfarim and thousands of articles, it was all those yellow pages, longhand. He wrote everything until his last day. The computer, he knows how to turn on. He'll turn on the daf, or he'll call me, Shalom, I can't get the daf. What's going on? Is it up yet? But he looked at email. So my father receives an email from a woman in Scotland who recognized my father's name on the internet. He saw some of his books. Are you the Freddie Rosner that was in an orphanage in Scotland during World War II? In England during World War II? My father responds, yes. How do you know me? She responds back, I took care of you. My father's like, what are you talking about? There was a whole orphanage. She's like, I'd rather tell you in person. So at that time, my father was still lecturing publicly. So he arranged to be in Scotland, and Dr. Steinberg, Kent Shiva call, said he was at this meeting. my father's chevra is Dr. Steinberg and Shimon Glick and Reb Mordechai Halpern, the medical ethics chevra. So Dr. Steinberg went on many of the trips with my father. So they were in Scotland, and they meet this woman, this Jewish social worker. And my father says, how do you remember me? And he says, you had a brother, right? He says, yeah, I have a brother, 7 years older. So she says, the orphanage was only for older children. They went to your brother. How old was he? He was 10. See, they went to school during the day and they came home and they slept in the orphanage. You were 3. The orphanage wasn't for 3-year-olds. So what happened? Every Sunday morning, we used to dress you up in your finest and take you to the church in the neighborhood. And then families from the countryside would come and choose who to adopt, which little kids to adopt, and to bring home and to bring up how many Jewish souls we lost from those families. But your brother, he held your hand. And he said, you're not taking him without me. You take him, you're taking me with you. Nobody wanted a 10-year-old. So they'd had a problem. They didn't know what to do. So you were stuck, 3 years old, in this orphanage. So they called me. I was a social worker in the area. And they said, we have a problem. So I moved into the orphanage. You slept in my room. I bathed you. I changed you. I played with you for 4 years until you were old enough to go to school. And then you went to school. My uncle was still alive at the time. And he was a jeweler. He lived in Canarsie. He worked at 47th Street. Pasha Jew. Pasha in quotes. Simple Jew. I went up to Uncle Eli. I said, he didn't remember anything. Was it just an older brother that was not letting his, was it my grandmother when she put him on the train? You don't let him out of your sight. That's one thing I'm telling, we don't know. But we found out the story 50 years later. We were zocha to know my uncle was still alive. So a couple of years later, after he was nifter, we had one of our sons named Eliyahu. One other story that we found out about 10 years ago or so, there was a mutual friend of my father, and he had a colleague who was also knew someone whose son lives in Beit Shemesh. He was talking to him. The guy in Beit Shemesh, his father, they had a mutual colleague. So he's talking to him, do you remember anything about the war? He's like, well, I was in an orphanage in Ilkley. That's the small town in northern England. Do you remember anything from the orphanage? He said, not much. He says, I'll tell you one thing. He says, I was always scared. I was always scared of being alone. I didn't like being alone. So you know what? At night, that was the worst. I don't want to be the last one up. I remember there was a really little kid who was a math genius who, I would just ask him math problems at night. So I knew while he was trying to work out the math problem, I would fall asleep. Says I knew. That's why it comforted me. So I have no idea where he is today. His name was Freddie Rosner. Maybe he's a math professor somewhere getting the Nobel Prize. He's like, actually, his son lives a few blocks away, and he's in Yerushalayim. So we had them meet each other. They didn't remember each other, but my father didn't remember. So my father ended up, in 1945, he comes to Belgium, and he's there for the next 4 years. My father he starts learning Aleph Beis. My father, he was in high school already in secular studies, but he didn't know Aleph Beis till he was 11. My father didn't know Aleph Beis until he was 11. And he learned Aleph Beis, and he learned Parshas Ha'azinu. That was his Bar Mitzvah Parsha. It was the last thing we were laning with him on the day of his Patira. Maybe we'll get back to that. But they put in, they were there for a couple of years. My grandparents, the nuclear family, that amazingly, Kadosh Baruch Hu was Ud Mutzal Me'esh, that survived. They put in for visas to Israel and to America. American ones came first. So they went to America. My father says July 1st, 1949, they came in on the boat, and 100 degrees, boiling hot. They had relatives in Washington Heights. July 1st, July 2nd, 1949, my father was 14. My grandfather takes him into the YU base medrash, and he wants him to go to MTA. And they walk in, they didn't know anything, they don't know anybody. All of a sudden, a rabbi runs over, V'smachstu, where are you from? What's going on? I want him to go. So the rabbi takes my father and goes over to some kollel guy, July 2nd, and says, you're learning with him this summer. So that summer, every morning from 9 to 1, my father learned, I don't remember who the kollel guy was, but he learned the first Mishnah in Nesachas Baba Kama. That was the project that my father was learned. So by the end of the summer, this rabbi, who ended up being Reb David Lipschitz, who my father developed, that was his Rabbi. That was a lifetime friendship. So he arranged for my father to have a bechina with Reb Mendel Zaks, the Chavetz Chaim's son-in-law, who was the bochen at the time. My father said he was online, and all the guys are going, what do you want to, what do you know? Yavamis, or this, and this. My father's like, I don't know anything. He says, my grandfather, he says, not for me. Look at these guys. It's like, it's okay. Comes to my father's turn. So Rav Mendel's ex says that, no, what do you know? He says, the first Mishnah in Baba Kama. He's like, Zu zokt. So he says the first Mishnah, and he obviously sees my father's little different parsha. So he says, you want to learn? Do you want to be here? My father says, yes. He's like, okay, you're in. My father said, I know the Rashi. No, that was it. He didn't make him read the Rashi. He says, no, okay. But that's so my father went to MTA. That was 1949. Somehow he did high school. Again, my father didn't know much. He had to learn what a Mishnah was that summer. So he did high school in 2 years, seems like, because 1951, because then he went to YU. He was in the YU class of 1955. And then he obviously very much so wanted to be a doctor. I don't know where that came from, but it must be innate. And he always had this love of medicine. At that time, it was very hard for Jews to get into medical school, and that was the year that YU opened Einstein. My father was in the first class of Einstein, class of 59. He says that when he told Rav David Lipschitz that he was going into medicine, Rav David didn't talk to him for about a month. He said he wanted him to go into chinuch, he wanted him to be a rabbi. After a month, he calmed down, and he said, okay, you want to be a doctor? You got to be the best doctor. Okay. But that was my father's Rabbi. My father's, he considered Rav David his Rabbi. He went to him on Purim every year. So right before he started medical school, my father, he doesn't have smicha. He's not a rabbi. He was not a rabbi. He always said, I can speak freely. I'm not a rabbi. I'm just raising issues. My father always said, even though he gave many shiurim. So he took off the summer, 3 months, to learn Yoreh De'ah before medical school, before in between the college and Einstein. So he has many stories he tells over from that time period. He said Reb David came over to them every morning. He learned with Mel Zalewski. I think that was his chavrusa. So he said every day Reb David came over to him, talked to him and learning. I don't know exactly how it started, but he said once a week, maybe through Reb David, he went down to the Lower East Side and he Rav Moshe fired them every week on whatever simanim that they were learning. So he went once a week there. Just one story that some might be familiar with. So my father, when he was at that time period, so one of the other classmates and Kollel guys at the time was Rabbi Leibel Dulitz. I had Rabbi Dulitz for English in MTA, and he goes back many years with my father. His son was at the Levi in Israel. So one time Rabbi Dulitz comes over, and he's asking my father a question about Hilchos Treifus. He knew that these were the pre-med guys. My father was a pre-med. He asked him a kasha about something, and my father's explaining it to him 2 or 3 times. So my father said, I don't know. I did the best I can. I don't have a cow here. I don't know. I just did the best I can. The next morning, if you know Rabbi Dulitz, into the Beis Medrash, a brown paper bag dripping red. Fred, here, show me. It was the neck of a cow. Right, he brings it to the YA Beis Medrash. Show me. He needed to know, the MS. Unbelievable. My father said over that story, and Rabbi Dulitz's son confirms, but that was one of the stories in YU. My parents got married. My father graduated Einstein 1959. An amazing marriage. 63 years they were married. Rabbi David Lipschitz was mishadech them. My mother grew up on the Lower East Side, American. My grandfather was the Rav of the Bialystoker, the Lower East Side, Rabbi Yaskolsky, and my great-grandfather before him, 2 Rabbis Yaskolsky. So Rabbi David knew Rabbi Yaskolsky and Rav Moshe, so it was a chevret, but they helped set up my father with another, one of my father's friends also. So Rav Moshe was my parents' Masada Kedushin. They say the story is that Rav Moshe and Rav Aaron Cutler never went to the same wedding. This is the way it goes. Because who wouldn't be Masada Kedushin? So Rav Aaron told my parents, you know what, Rav Moshe will be Masada Kedushin, and I'll be Sandik at your first son's bris. So 11 months later, my brother was born, and Rav Aaron Cutler was the Sandik. So my parents got married. They lived in Borough Park and then Maryland for 2 years during the Vietnam War, and ultimately Far Rockaway. That's where they were for 50 years. My father was always the anchor of the shul. We spoke to the Rebbe, the Rebbe's son recently, but he was the Gabbai, he was the Balkorei, always acting, always getting involved. We have some Far Rockaway old timers here. In a shtibel, the Rebbe does everything. This is also unheard of. My father had the boys' minyan. What's the boys' minyan? Just for laning every week. Just for laning, he would go downstairs and have a boys' minyan where the boys would lane, and the boys would be gabbai, and the boys would get aliyahs, and the boys would, how many Farakaway boys? I learned to lane there. My brother, who's a professional balkore, learned to lane there. But that's he did that because he knew this is part of his tafkid to create a. We dive into the shtibel because that's a Hamish minyan, and but he said, I'm not going to not have this to be able to train my children and the children of the community, and that was part of his avoda. In the early 60s is when his quote-unquote hobby. He was a hematologist by profession. He was the head of medicine in Queens Hospital, Queens General, for 30 plus years. But on his side, Jewish medical ethics, a hobby that influenced so many. Just two of them, we've gotten many, tens of messages from all over. I just picked two of them yesterday. When my father graduated medical school, he is now about 75. Your father was an individual who opened to him and all the Shomrei Mitzvahs medical graduates a vista that many of them had not been exposed to. A giant of a clinician who was a master of halacha, who could write with force and expertise in both fields, and was a Jew of great ruchnius. Kasha od adam od limtso yakar hamitzias ka'avicha. Another one. From a young age, I developed a strong affinity for the medical halacha journals and writing compiled by your father, Zechron Levracha, often writing together with my family's Rav, Moshe David Tendler. Your father Zal was a trailblazing force in the field of medicine and halacha and a veritable expert in articulating the Jewish law guidelines to be followed by Jewish doctors and medical professionals in a myriad of different situations. May his memory be a blessing. So he was mashpia, or he created two of the influences that we think. Number one, the story is that somebody gave him for a medical school graduation present Rabbi Jacobowitz's sefer on Jewish medical ethics. My father considered Rabbi Jacobowitz the grandfather of Jewish medical ethics. Others have said that my father was the father of Jewish medical ethics. Rabbi Jacobowitz, he coined the term. That's number one. And also, he loved medicine, and he loved halacha, and he loved Torah. And the mixing and the meshing of those two was where he made such a mark. He wrote some of his memoirs a couple of years ago. He says that 1964 was the first Surgeon General warning against smoking. 1964. So he says that week he wrote an article about, as rabbis, some rabbis in the room, like if we could find an article about something, that's our shir. You take the article, you take the Marmakomos. It's basically a good way to cheat, but it's okay. You look up the Marmakomos. He didn't have any articles. He wrote the articles. He had to do the research. And you find an RJJ journal about a topic you want to give shir on. You're good. You're fine. They're pre-computers, but you're right. He said he wrote an article. He gave it to the first halachic journal. I don't know which one it was. They rejected it. They said, we can't print this. All the rabbis smoke. So he said, I don't care. He says, print it. This is the halacha. My father spent the next 20 years begging Rav Moshe to ask for smoking. The final tshuva in 1983 is written to my father, if you look in the Igros Moshe. But you see, over every 10 years, you read the 4 or 5 tshuvas, he's getting closer and closer and closer and closer, and then he said that he would ask, so he can't bring any rayas, what a shita would be today, but he had unbelievable accomplishments in this area. Half his books are on Jewish medical ethics, half his books are about the Rambam, his love. The last few decades, the Encyclopedia of Jewish Medical Ethics was one of his magnum opuses, the translation, but it's not a translation of Rabbi Steinberg's encyclopedia. To translate, you have to reorganize and, adjust everything. And the last 20 years or so were his translations of Rav Asher Weiss's tshuvas, and just the last number of years, the 10th volume came out within a year of Rav Zilberstein's 10 volumes of Shiurim L'Rofim. He loved to teach. He loved to share. Whether it's medicine, we got a WhatsApp during Shiva of somebody who said, you don't know me, but I just have to tell you this story. In all the years that I was taught, I was a resident and a doctor and an attending in Queens Hospital Center. The Mincha Minyan in Dr. Rosner's office was something to go to. Every day, it was my favorite part of the day. I remember the office, the green couches, and so we went there for Mincha, but he says the best thing was that after Mincha, your father gave like a 5-minute talk about something. And that was like, you had plenty of non-Jews that came, and like imams or whatever. They wanted to hear what Dr. Rosner said about that. Because my father projected, the view, not just to Jews. I remember one Friday morning in elementary school. I remember I got to stay home from school. Why? My father was going to be on TV. I remember the Phil Donahue show. Remember the Phil Donahue show, right? Sam, I remember there was a movie out, Richard Dreyfuss. Whose life is it anyway? About somebody who's, I never saw the movie. I don't know anything. I just remember seeing this movie star on TV with my father sitting there. I'm like, right, that. But I remember but what's the Jewish view? What's the ethical view? Right, he loved to teach. Whether in shul, he was the backup for Rabbi Pelkovitz on Shabbos afternoon in the White Shul. This is what his life was about. His life was about sharing and teaching. 1988, my father was invited to Germany, to Berlin, on the 50th anniversary of Kristallnacht. My father he flew all over the world. He kept copious journals of every single talk he ever gave. We have 20 volumes. In the journal is the invitation letter, the flyer, the thank you letter. It's unbelievable. And the chashivos that he gives every talk. He'll speak in front of Congress, he'll speak on ABC, and then he'll give a post-night activity talk in the Camp Morashah canteen for 4 counselors. It gets the same chashivos, right? It's all sharing. But in 1988, he got an invitation. Growing up in our house, anything German or Germany, anything, it was, treif would be an understatement. I remember walking to the White Shul from our house in Far Rockaway. I remember somebody had a Mercedes. On the left side, we mamish couldn't look. We weren't, like to look there, it was Rahman al-Islam, this is where he was from. 1980, and he always spoke all over the world, but he received an invitation from Germany. He always said no. But this one, they really wanted him to come. They really wanted him to come. It's something with the Rambam also. And he was from Germany. So he didn't know what to do, so he asked Reb David. Reb David was his lifelong Rabbi. Reb David was alive at the time. What should I do? My father even made a neder that he would never go back. So Reb David says to spread Torah, you can be matur neder, but you have to ask your father. My grandfather was still alive at the time. So he asked my grandfather, and he didn't know what he was going to say. He says, if you could go to Kever Avos. What's Kever Avos? On Kristallnacht, my great-grandfather had a stroke. After what he witnessed, he is my father's father's father-in-law, my father's mother's father. And he had a stroke and he died a few days later. He's the only relative that has a kever. So my grandfather said, if you could go to Kever Avos. That kever is in East Berlin, right at the time, right, when the wall was up. So he didn't know. So he sent messages. Would he be able to go? They got permission. They'll be able to go. My father was like, okay. So he was matur neder. And he went. Rabbi Steinberg, Dr. Steinberg, who was at the Shiva house, he says he went with my father. My father did not leave the hotel room except twice. So they're not walking on soil. He says twice. Once to go to the kever and once to give his talk. So he says the kever, Dr. Steinberg said, he says we were at the wall. We were there for about two hours. They took off our glasses. They were like looking for contraband in the metal. They said it was crazy until they let him through. They finally let him through. We have pictures, mamish like you would have imagined. A blizzard, snow, you can't find anything. But they found the kever. They found the kever of my great-grandfather. My father was there. And then he gave one talk there. And this talk was titled, we have a copy of the talk, Why I Returned to Berlin 50 years after I promised never to go back. That was the title of the talk. I just remember one thing. We were looking at it during Shiva. One thing he says, JFK was here 30 years ago. And he said, Ich bin ein Berliner. He had no right to say that. I was born here. I could say that. I can explain to you why I returned 50 years later. Some of the stories. Baruch Hashem, my parents were zocha to make aliyah about 9 years ago. Their children pre-aliyah them. As long as my father was working part-time, it was important for him to stay, but Hurricane Sandy and stopped working, so my brother-in-law and I, went and brought them on their aliyah trip. 5 messages, quick, short messages that we could spend more time, but 5 messages. Number 1 is time. My father didn't waste a second. He didn't waste a second. And he, every moment was accounted for. I never saw him chilling, as it was said, just hanging out. He didn't do that. Right? There was a cartoon on his desk with a guy lying on a couch and a psychiatrist. But doctor, relaxing makes me tense. Right? But he never wasted a minute. Everything was part of his avoda. But he swam and he jogged. My friend just told me, I remember him jogging down Reed's Lane. Everything was part of the schedule. I went, I thought it was a kiyum, because 2 nights ago, I took my boys that I have in America right now to the Mets, to the Met game. My father took me to 2 Met games every year before the season, which days we're going to go. So I felt it. I took a picture of my siblings. I said, it's a kiyum for daddy. It's they won. It was good. But that was also part of the schedule. Part of the schedule was learning and teaching. There was no wasting. Rav Zevin, we mentioned him before. Rav Zevin has an unbelievable vart on Parshas Emor, where he says that everything in life, those who listen to the shiurim probably have heard much of what I say, everything in life has a certain time that it exists. People exist for a certain amount of time. A tree exists for a certain amount of time. Everything exists. Even is this shtender going to be here in 1,000 years? It'll probably disintegrate. I don't know, something with the atmosphere. I don't know. Everything has a certain amount of time. It can be very long, it can be short. Everything in life has a certain amount of time except for one thing, and that's time itself. Time has no time. The second that the moment is here, it's gone. Time has no time. And yet, ironically, says Rav Zevin, the only thing that we could take with us for eternity is our time. If we fill our moments with Torah and mitzvos and chesed and giving, those days come with us forever. V'Avram Zakein, ba b'yamim. He came with all his days. My father took all his days with him. My father stands in Shamayim with all of his days. Every moment. We davened in a shtibel growing up, as I mentioned. My father moved to Far Rockaway, so 1965, the day my sister was born. So there were 4 shuls, I think, 3.5. Right? There was the White Shul, and there was the Sharei Tefillah by Wurzburger, the Rebbe's, the Solitzer, Rabbi Rubin. They said the Young Israel was just starting at the time. My father liked the Hamish davening. That's why he davened in the shtibel in Washington Heights. He liked it. So we davened at the Rebbe's. At night we davened at the White Shul because of Zmanim. He wouldn't miss the Zman. He wouldn't daven after us. He davened there. So when Shachar Shabbos morning, 9 o'clock, brachas, 9:15 Hodu. They think, okay, 1 day a week. My father had a chavrusa, 7 a.m. every Shabbos morning. Those are some of my earliest memories, waking up to hear him learning with his chavrusa. Some of my earliest memories. His chavrusa had a very deep voice. Dr. Aaron Twersky was a law professor on Hofstra. So he learned, I remember waking up to some of those sounds. 7 a.m., Shabbos, what? You daven at a shtibel, so you're gonna sleep till 9. Using time. Using time was, I thought it was a kiyum that my father would appreciate. I remember the last day I was in camp, Monday. I was in camp. I got the call that I should fly back to Israel on Monday morning. Monday morning, I wake up. I knew it was I was going to go back later, but Monday morning, my siblings called and said, you should go back, you should come back. So Monday morning, so I got on the flight, the 1:15 from Newark. I'm going to get there. I'm like, okay, so I had about an hour in camp. I had prepared the daf for that day the night before. So I really wanted to give it. I'm like, let's give it. It was too crazy. I had to get the passports and get ready. So I didn't give the daf in camp. Okay. So I flew back. We landed. My brother and I landed on Tuesday morning, and my father was semi-stable, but we got there early in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning. So the whole day we were with him in the hospital. So the afternoon time, and we didn't know how long, but I'm like, I have this daf. I'm not going to be able to give it for a week. I'm like, I know my father would want me to. So first I was sitting in the hospital, he wasn't we didn't know how much. I'm sure inside he heard everything, but he wasn't communicative at that time. So I was learning, my brother and I were learning the daf with him. I said, I told my brother, do you know anybody in the hospital? I need a room. I'm like, I can't give the daf in the ICU. So he's like, I know somebody in the genetics lab. So he called somebody in genetics lab. He's like, genetics, what, for what? Your brother? I listened to some of his shiurim. So anyway, they got me a room on the 5th floor. So I went to my father. I said, Daddy, I said, I know you want me to give the daf. I said, you don't waste a second. I'm trying. I'm just going to go give the daf. I have my phone. I'm going to give the daf. So I went down to the 5th floor in the genetics lab. The guy gave me a room and a table. I got my computers out. I got the Gemara out. Gave the daf. Uploaded it. Yosei went back. My father was still the same at that stage. And 2 hours later, we were all zochet to be with him. But I learned that from my father because he would want to use every moment, mamish every moment. So number one is time. Number two is avdus. My father was an Eved Hashem. Everything about his life was centered around Avodas Hashem. He loved the story that he said over so many times of the Sfas Emes. Many of you have heard it. The Sfas Emes says to his Hasidim on the morning of a Sukkot, he says, make sure you have kavana by Ana Hashem. When you say Ana Hashem, make sure you have kavana. And there was a whole machlokas amongst the Hasidim. Half of them screamed out, Ana Hashem Oshiana, they screamed out. And the other, Ana Hashem Atzlichana. And they asked the Imri Emes afterwards, who is right? And he says, you're both wrong. Ana Hashem ki ani avdecha. That's the special kavana. And that's my father. My father's life is avoda, davening, like it wasn't like getting out of bed and freezing. I remember growing up. It's like we get up in the morning. He always went to the first minyan. Or sometimes I'm like, Daddy, can we drive? No, we're gonna walk. It's like, what? No, we're walking. Let's go. I'm like, come on! It's so early and dark outside. No, like davening, benching, like brachas. Wouldn't put anything to his mouth without a bracha. What bracha do you make on this? Just everything was. And the Rambam, you have to walk after you eat. So it doesn't matter. Friday night, got to take a walk, right? Got to take a walk, after you eat, because this is what the Rambam says, and this is what the halacha is, right? I want to be your Eved. Ana Hashem ki ani avdecha. Really, he was an ultimate Eved Hashem with all of his background. Number 3 out of 5. Number 3, Rav Hutner has a letter, somewhat well-known letter, where a Talmud said to him that he feels like a fake. Right? Like he's one person here and he's one person there, at work, at home, what the Talmud called a double life. And Rav Hutner answers, no, it's not a double life, it's a broad life. A broad life. Meaning you're the same person in all the different areas. My father had a very broad life. But he was the same person everywhere. The same person who could speak internationally in front of thousands of Jews and non-Jews. And give the rabbi shir and shul, and be the father who takes me to a Met game and learns with me on Friday night, and being a doctor, right? Many people at the Shiva said, forget medical ethics. He was amazing, but medical, we called him with our medical shilas, the unbelievable medical genius that he was, and how he thought of different elements. He was the head of the New York State ethics committee, which has nothing to do with Judaism, but he was. Same unassuming attitude, humble, not taking, always saying that I'm just speaking freely. I'm not a rabbi. I said that often, but making Kiddush Hashem in all areas of his life. So using every moment, being an Eved Hashem, being the same person in every venue that he found himself. 4, adaptation. He adapted to every situation that HaKadosh Baruch Hu threw his way. Being in an orphanage, not knowing his parents. Somebody asked me at the Shiva, did your father ever express anything about being put on the kinder transport? I'm like, no. This is his matzav, and this is what he does. What's my next step? What's my next step forward? Orphanage. He had a major heart attack in the early 1990s. He had a stroke in the 2001. He couldn't do his own research anymore. Okay, what can I do? What are my abilities? The Rav Steinberg was after he had his stroke, or after the heart attack. The Rav Zilberstein, the 10 volumes, he just translate. I can't do my own research now, so I'll translate. I still have that skill and that ability. Came out within the year. He adapted. After my mother was niftarah 2 years ago. Her yahrzeit's next week. Right? New reality. My father was always the one that was ill. We got a helper from my father, an aide, before my mother got sick. So it's just, but my father said, okay, what do I have a new sidekick. What could I do now? What could I accomplish now? And that's what he did. Sameach bechelko. Not just about assets, but sameach bechelko, about whatever situation he is in life. Right? Hashem gives us a chelek and he makes the most of it. Moshe Rabbeinu also didn't have such a childhood. He grew up in the house of Paro, run around, but you make the most of everything HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives you. And number 5, final point. Hayom katzar v'malacha meruba. He had an inner drive that never stopped. I said at the Levaya, he never had menucha. From a very young age, he was driven. What's my next project? What's my next book? Rabbi Yonah writes on Pirkei Avos, on that Mishnah, life is like a shopping spree. It's like, whatever gold you pick up in the next 24 hours is yours. You want to take a nap? That's your choice. We have a 120-year shopping spree. Obviously, we have to be normal. My parents always wanted me to be normal. They said, the Rosh Shiva of Shalom, Rav Yaakovson, came out of the Shiva. She's like, your mother met me before Shana Bet, and she said, Rabbi, he wants to come Shana Bet, and he wants to learn. He's like, but we want him to be normal. We want him to remain Shalom. And Rabbi Yaakovson said, I hope that we helped, succeeded, and so you don't want me to do too much this way, too much that way. But there was a drive. There was a drive he had. The last few months of my father's life, after he finished the final Reb Zilberstein, so we're looking at more projects to, what can we do? So he's translating in Asya to get him excited about something. So I said, Daddy, I'll be translating one of my Svarim. He's like, wow, great. So I remember a few months ago, so I went to sit down, I got him set up in his apartment in Yerushalayim. So I set up with the Sefer and his notebook and his cup of pens and his dictionary. This was his life. His hobby on the side, but his life. So he sits down, opens up, table of contents, he writes, table of contents on top. Then he looks, Yom Ram, high holidays, his English was English. And then he was trying, he's like, I'm like, okay, we'll continue more next time. So he did a little bit. And we tried, I was there once or twice over the last couple of months, trying because translating was hard. It takes the vision and the concentration, and he could still listen to the dafim and listen to the parsha shir and listen to the navi, like this, whatever. It doesn't matter if it's last week's parsha or whatever it is. My parents were my biggest fans. My mother used to call up, the Torah tidbits that come. So my mother would call up on Thursday. Shalom, guess who's on the cover? I said, Rav Judah Michel. He's like, no. Page 26 is a great page. They were my biggest fans. But again, everything came from them. But anyway, so I set this up for my father, and we tried. But it was hard towards the end. And so after the Patira that day, so I went back to my father's apartment to pick something up before I went home. I walked into the apartment, and I see on the dining room table, I see my sefer open to the first page, and I see the notebook and the pen, and I see the cup of pens. I see the dictionary. I said to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I said, my father tried to the last minute. My father tried. This is a testament. Right? Until he had no koach, he tried, and he was driven. And it was a life of avdus, and it was a life of samech bechelko. And everything that he accomplished was not knowing Aleph Beis until he was 11 years old. So let's even take a little bit, A, to use our time, B, to focus our life, Eved Hashem, to recognize we're the same person in the business world, in the Beis Medrash, in the shul, wherever we are, we're making a Kiddush Hashem. Number 4, to adapt to any circumstance that HaKadosh Baruch Hu throws our way. We don't choose. We don't choose our cards. Right? We don't choose our cards. We do what we can with the hashgacha from our side. And finally, to always try to be driven to something. Again, it doesn't mean that we're not normal and we don't have relaxation, as my father had that also. But he had a drive to be an Eved Hashem. Maybe the achrayus of being the one that survived, the family that, the Udmut Sol Me'esh, whatever it was, it went from his birthday, Tov Yom Hamav Es Miyom Yivaldo. So on this night, the night of his Shloshim, we try to take a little bit of Imori, Areni Kaparas Mishkavo, Chaim Meir, Ben Yoshua, and we should be able to be Zochet to follow in his footsteps. He did so much. The OU he never went officially, but the AOJS and all those organizations, he was always very supportive of and involved in. And B'ez Hashem, we should be Zochet to follow in his footsteps and follow in his ways, and keep up learning from him for many years.